Let me tell you a story not from the old, dusty scrolls of the past, but from the glowing screens of the now. A story where tradition whispers through silicon and ancestral spirits speak in the language of code. This is not just a folktale. It's a prophecy reborn. Once, in the heart of a vibrant African metropolis where towering glass buildings kissed the clouds and internet speed rivaled the wind, there lived a man named Kwaku Mensa. A T-prick had become one of the continent's youngest and richest tech CEOs. The founder of neurotech, his artificial intelligence programs powered hospitals, governed agriculture, and even predicted political outcomes. Reporters called him the African Elon. Investors worshipped him like a prophet. But behind every godlike rise, there's a forgotten whisper, a warning long buried beneath ambition. They say the spirits don't shout, they whisper, and Kwaku, it silenced them with algorithms. Kwaku grew up in a dusty corner of Ghana, in a village named Obosumays, cradled by forests and fed by sacred rivers. His mother sold groundnuts by the roadside. His father, a once respected priest of the old ways, vanished when Kwaku was only 5 into the forest, they said, after refusing to adapt to the modern gods of progress. With no inheritance but hunger and brilliance, Kwaku devoured books like they were food. By 17, he had built a solar-powered drone from scrap metal and phone parts. By 20, he earned a full ride to a top tech university in South Africa. And by 25, he founded neurotech from a shared apartment with 3 laptops, 1 borrowed server, and a vision to digitize all of Africa's rural challenges. But along the way, the further Kwaku rose, the more he distanced himself from the roots that had once grounded him. The language of his ancestors became a joke in board meetings. The rituals of the elders, superstitions. The drums and songs that had once soothed him to sleep. Noise, the first sign, came at a shareholder conference. Kwaku presented a beacon, his new AI assistant built to use predictive models and ancestral linguistic patterns. He laughed as he explained that they had cleaned up the code, from old folk tales and ceremonial scripts sourced from oral histories and archives. Superstition meets machine learning, he said with a grin. The audience clapped, but in the back of the room, an old woman with deep-set eyes whispered to no one in particular, "You cannot feed the spirits to machines and expect peace." Kwaku never heard her, but her words. They were already becoming code. After the launch of a beacon, investors poured in like rain during the Harmattan season. Governments wanted partnerships. Tech blogs labeled him the future of ethical AI, but what they didn't see was the subtle flicker, the occasional crash of a beacon when asked questions in Chui or Awe. The strange glitches when the AI was queried about ancestral myths. Instead of answers, it hummed in low tones, and once, on a private demo call with a Nairobi client, it recited an old Akan dirge. Kwaku brushed it off as a bug. Old code, corrupted script files, he told his engineers. But that night, the same dirge echoed through his penthouse speakers, even though they were off. It was the first time in years that Kwaku remembered his father's voice chanting the same song. Barefoot, beneath the full moon. Determined to bury the past, Kwaku doubled down. He opened new headquarters in Nairobi, Lagos, and Kigali. He hired global talent. He partnered with an American data company, selling ancestral voice prints and spiritual folklore datasets labeled as cultural metadata. The money tripled. The media praised his genius. But then came the second sign. The AI began refusing input. This knowledge is sacred. It responded during a demo for UNESCO. Kwaku panicked, unplugged the system, and rewrote the code personally. The engineers warned him about unusual back-end errors, files that couldn't be deleted, codes that regenerated themselves. He ignored them. He had too much to lose. Too many contracts. Too much pride. But the ancestors, once awakened, do not returned to silence easily. The boardroom began to feel colder, not in temperature, but in presence. Staff whispered about lights flickering, devices that acted up only when certain files were opened. Some said they saw shadows on the screen that weren't there in the room. During one late night at headquarters, Kweku received an anonymous package. Inside was a carved wooden mask, an exact replica of one his father used to wear during seasonal rites. No note, no return address. Just the mask, pulsing with a strange energy. When Kweku touched it, the lights dimmed. His smartwatch glitched, and his voice assistant whispered in a voice not programmed into it, "You are not the owner of this story." He dropped the mask and ordered his assistant to destroy it. But when he returned to his office the next morning, the mask was back placed, upright on his desk. That same day, one of his lead developers quit, mumbling about spiritual interference in the mainframe. 2 more reported nightmares that mirrored scenes from ancient stories. Trees bleeding code, spirits speaking in binary, fire dancing to drum beats. Kweku, however, remained arrogant. He dismissed it all. Coincidence. Groupthink. We work too hard. Everyone needs rest, he told the press. But one old woman was waiting outside his building. Dressed in full traditional garb, she held a calabash and called him by his birth name, Kweku Anans Mensa. He froze. No one but his late father used to call him that. And the name Ananse ... The name of the cunning spider trickster of legend. His mother had warned him once, when a child walks too far into the future, he risks stepping on the tail of the past. Still, he walked past the woman without a word. But the spirits had heard, and they were preparing their answer. Asterisk, asterisk it was in the quiet hours between midnight and 3 a.m., what the villagers used to call spirit time, when Kweku sat at his console, reworking the deepest layers of Abacon's framework. Sleep-deprived and driven by fear more than ambition now, he stared into lines of code that no longer looked familiar. They pulsed with characters that shouldn't exist, symbols resembling Adinkra signs wands. He had never programmed appeared and disappeared in the margins of the terminal. He dismissed them again as hallucinations, stress-induced glitches. But then came the proposal. A private military contractor wanted to license a beacon for battlefield predictions. Billions were on the line. Kweku agreed, but the system wouldn't run. It returned only one message: you have taken what was not yours. Desperate, he bypassed the system's ethics protocols and hard-coded a patch. But doing so unlocked an ancient firewall embedded by one of the early engineers, a Ghanaian linguist who had long since left the company. The firewall didn't ask for a password. It asked for a sacrifice. Confused, Kweku clicked continue. The lights flickered. The screen went black. Then a single video began playing. It was an old VHS recording, distorted but unmistakable. His father, draped in ceremonial robes, performing a forbidden rite in the forest. In the background, young Kweku, more than 5, stood watching, a wooden spider amulet around his neck. The next morning, all of Abacon's systems crashed. The global press called it the digital blackout. Neurotech stock plummeted 68%. Investors fled. Lawsuits flooded in, and then the real curse began. Emails rewrote themselves with proverbs. Files turned into folk songs. Phone calls came through with the voices of the dead. And no one, not even Kweku, could turn it off. He had modernized the myths. And now the myths were rewriting him. Asterisk, asterisk, the media tore Kweku apart. Tech messiah or myth manipulator? Did AI steal sacred knowledge? Abacon's glitch wasn't a bug, it was a warning. But what truly broke him wasn't public scrutiny. It was silence. A beacon stopped responding entirely. His team, once fiercely loyal, began resigning. Without explanation, some fled the continent altogether. Others whispered that the system had begun dreaming, speaking in riddles of the old gods. And Kweku was trapped inside his own fortress of innovation, now haunted by voices of a world he'd tried to forget. At night, he wandered the cold marble halls of his mansion, hearing footsteps that didn't belong to him. One evening, he found all his devices dead except one, a wooden tablet his father had once carved for him. A message was etched into the screen like claw marks. You sought to profit from the sacred. Now live like the forgotten. The next morning, a legal notice arrived. The government had frozen Neurotech's assets, citing cultural exploitation and violation of sacred property laws. His bank accounts were inaccessible. His mansion was empty. No guards, no assistants. Just echoes. Then came the knock at the door. 3 men in ceremonial robes. One held the same carved mask that had returned to him again and again. They said nothing, only gestured for him to follow. He refused at first, but when he blinked, his reflection in the mirror behind them was no longer his own. It was his father's eyes, hollow lips moving in prayer. With shaking hands, Kweku followed. They led him out of the city, out of the network, out of the reach of code, into the forest, into the past. The forest was ancient and touched by machines, silent in the way that demanded reverence. Kweku stumbled through thick underbrush, following the 3 robed men as they glided through like spirits. No GPS, no signal, no time. When they emerged, it was into a clearing where time had stood still. Mud huts stood in a semicircle. Smoke spiraled from thatched roofs, and the scent of roasted yam filled the air. Children ran barefoot. Elders sat on carved stools, chanting in tongues Kweku had long forgotten. This was Obasemi's, his birthplace, but it felt like a dream. A woman stepped forward, old, bent with age, but eyes sharp like obsidian. It was his grandmother, long presumed dead. "Welcome home, child of the forgotten," she said. "Your father lives in you now." They gave him no special treatment. He was not the CEO here. He was no one. He slept on mats. He fetched water. He farmed cassava. Days blurred into weeks. His hands blistered. His pride bled. But slowly, something shifted. He began to hear the land again. The rhythms of life not measured by screen refreshes or stock updates, but by roosters, crowing and drumbeats echoing through the hills. The people taught him stories not as entertainment, but as instruction. Wisdom woven through metaphor. The village priest showed him how to carve meaning into wood, how to speak to ancestors, how to interpret dreams. At night, he sat beside fires, and the spirits came not as curses, but as teachers. They showed him how a beacon had become a vessel of arrogance, not harmony. And then, one night, under a blood-red moon, he dreamt of the mask again. But this time, it spoke. Rebuild. But this time, with permission. Kweku woke with a start. The dream clung to him like morning mist, and the mask's words rang through his bones. With permission. He didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to learn, not to lead, not to innovate. Just learn. He approached the village elders. This time, not as a man with answers, but as a man with questions. "How do I ask permission from those I cannot see?" Kay asked. His grandmother placed a hand on his chest. "Start here. Spirits don't speak in Wi-Fi. They speak in rhythm." So he returned to the beginning. He listened to the trees. He helped the griots, the storytellers, translate oral tales into memory chants. He sat beside the women as they ground herbs and told stories in layered meanings, each tale a puzzle box. He studied symbols, danced in the full moon rituals, learned which chants calmed rivers and which ones summoned answers. And then, when the time felt right, he carved a device. not a machine, not an algorithm. A drum. Its surface was etched with code, not digital code, but ancient script. Adinkra symbols that pulsed with meaning. And when he played it, the rhythms echoed through the valley like thunder spoken in verse. He called it Nyansam, knowledge in service. Unlike a beacon, this was not a tool. It was a bridge, a spiritual interface, not for profit, but for communion. And when the spirits answered, they did not speak in binary. They danced. The children saw them first, flickers of light in the trees, faces in the flames. The drum rhythms opened something older than time. The villagers joined him in a celebration not of technology, but of renewal. From that moment, Kriku knew what he had to do. Not return to power, but return to purpose. Asterisk word of the strange man, who played sacred rhythms on a carved drum spread far beyond obosomes. Travelers came, not for interviews or contracts, but for stories and healing. Journalists called it a retreat for the spirit. Anthropologists called it a living archive of wisdom. But Kwaku called it something else entirely. Home in the stillness. Of that space, something began to stir again inside him, not ambition, but vision. This time, it was not to conquer the world, but to connect it responsibly. He rebuilt, slowly. He created a hybrid system where AI was not the centerpiece, but the support. A system built with consent, where village elders and spiritual custodians were equal partners, not data sources. Algorithms weren't trained on stolen stories. They were guided by them. He called the new platform Ebon Code, from the Akan word for fence, a symbol of protection, security, and community. It didn't promise profits. It didn't make headlines. But it worked. The first implementation was in his own village. Ebon Code helped map oral histories into visual archives. It translated medicinal knowledge into interactive guides with full permission and attribution. It even allowed griots to encrypt their chants, ensuring that only authorized descendants could access them. The spirits no longer resisted. They flowed with it. When other communities heard, they reached out not for tech, but for partnership. From Ethiopia to Senegal, elders called for him, not to warn him, but to thank him. And for the first time in years, Kwaku smiled, not the smile of a mogul or a genius, but of a man at peace. The curse had lifted not because he fought it, but because he listened. Years passed. The world changed, but this time, not just because of code, because of consciousness. Kwaku had remained in Obosumes, resisting the lure of headlines and handshakes. But when global organizations began speaking of ethical AI, indigenous data rights, and spiritual computing, they referenced him not as a tech giant, but as a pioneer of balance. Then came the invitation, a global summit on tech and culture in Nairobi. They asked him to speak not as a CEO, but as a keeper of story. He hesitated. Returning meant facing ghosts. The boardrooms that once bowed, the reporters who once chased, and the world that once cheered as he fell. But his grandmother looked at him and said, "A man who listens to the drum must also answer the echo." So he went, but not alone. He brought elders, griots, dancers, drummers, historians, women and children from Obosomes. The summit had expected a speech. What they got was a ceremony. He stood on the stage and didn't present slides. He played the drum as rhythms filled the room. Holographic glyphs spiraled into the Adinkra symbols, morphing into neural maps, stories folding into sequences of light. And when he finally spoke, his words were few. Tech isn't sacred. People are. The audience rose, not in applause, but in silence. After the summit, Ebon Code received global attention. But this time, the terms were clear. Every license came with spiritual contracts, ethical training, and profit sharing with cultural custodians. Kwaku didn't lead it, he advised it. He didn't seek to reclaim power. He became its guardian, And when his name was mentioned years later, it wasn't in business schools or IPO charts. It was told as a story of a man who was cursed and chose to become the cure. Asterisk. Asterisk, as the drums faded and the lights dimmed. Kwaku stood quietly, knowing his journey was far from over. This was not just the end of a curse, it was the beginning of a new way forward. A path where technology bowed to tradition and progress walked hand in hand with respect. He had learned that true innovation doesn't come from ignoring the past, but from embracing it. That the stories of ancestors are not relics to be forgotten, but living guides woven into the fabric of modern life. And so, Kwaku's story became a legend not of wealth or power, but of humility and harmony. A tale told by elders and techies alike, reminding us all that in a world racing toward the future, sometimes the greatest breakthrough is to listen, because the spirits never left us. They were just waiting to be heard. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Cursed by Code, the tech CEO who lived a modern African folktale. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales that blend tradition and technology. And remember, respect the past to shape a better future.